The sound of his palm striking her face echoed through the marble lobby like a gunshot. Rebecca Walsh stood frozen in the opulent Grandview Hotel lobby, her hand instinctively moving to protect her 7-month pregnant belly as her left cheek burned with the sting of Jonathan's slap. The sharp crack had cut through the ambient chatter of evening guests, leaving an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch forever. "You embarrassed me in front of Peterson," Jonathan Cross hissed through gritted teeth, his designer suit doing nothing to hide the rage contorting his features. At 38, the tech CEO commanded respect in boardrooms across the country, but tonight his carefully constructed image cracked like ice under pressure. "Do you have any idea what that contract means to my company?" Rebecca's vision blurred with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of all these people. She could feel dozens of eyes on them, hear the subtle whispers starting to build like a gathering storm. Someone's phone was definitely recording. She caught the telltale glow from her peripheral vision. "I only asked if his wife would be joining us for dinner," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible. At 29, she'd learned to make herself small when Jonathan's temper flared, but pregnancy had made her bolder lately. Maybe it was the hormones, or maybe it was the growing realization that she couldn't let her child grow up witnessing this kind of behavior. "His wife left him last month because of the insider trading investigation," Jonathan snapped, grabbing her upper arm with enough force to leave marks. "Thanks to your thoughtless comment, he's questioning my judgment, my ability to handle my own household." Behind the mahogany concierge desk, a bellhop in his late 50s watched the scene unfold with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to maintaining discipline under pressure. Frank Walsh had seen plenty of domestic disputes during his 25 years in the Navy, but this one hit different. This one made his hands shake as he gripped the marble counter. He hadn't seen his daughter in 8 years, not since their explosive argument after her mother's funeral. But he'd recognize Rebecca anywhere. Those determined green eyes, the way she lifted her chin when facing adversity, the stubborn set of her shoulders that reminded him so much of her mother. She was beautiful, glowing with pregnancy, and married to a monster he'd been investigating for 8 months. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on him. Commander Frank Walsh, working undercover for Navy intelligence, monitoring Jonathan Cross's suspicious defense contracts, never expected his surveillance mission to become personal. But watching his estranged daughter absorb abuse from the man he was building a treason case against, that changed everything. "Jonathan, please," Rebecca said, glancing around at the growing crowd of onlookers. "People are staring." "Let them stare," he replied, his voice carrying the cold authority that had built his tech empire. "Maybe they'll learn something about respect." Frank forced himself to maintain his cover, straightening the hotel name tag that identified him as Frank Wilson. His weathered hands smoothed the burgundy bellhop uniform that had been his disguise for months. At 58, his military bearing was harder to hide than he'd expected, but hotel guests rarely looked closely at service staff. "Sir," Frank said, stepping forward with practiced deference, "perhaps the lady would benefit from some fresh air? The garden terrace is quite lovely this evening." Jonathan's cold gaze fixed on the bellhop with the irritation of a man unused to interruption. "Mind your own business, old man. This is between me and my wife." Rebecca's eyes met Frank's for a split second, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition? Impossible. He looked nothing like the crisp Navy officer she'd known, and the gray had completely taken over his hair. But there was something in her gaze that made his heart race. "Of course, sir," Frank replied, his military training helping him project calm while every instinct screamed to protect his child. "I simply noticed the lady appears distressed. Perhaps she might prefer to rest in your suite." The suggestion was tactical. Get them somewhere private where Frank could monitor the situation without blowing his cover. Jonathan's business meeting tomorrow night would culminate 8 months of surveillance, and he couldn't compromise the operation. Not when national security was at stake. But as he watched Jonathan's grip tighten on Rebecca's arm, Frank realized some missions mattered more than others. "Actually, yes," Jonathan said, his tone suggesting the decision was entirely his own. "We'll retire for the evening. The Peterson situation requires my full attention tomorrow." He turned toward the elevators, practically dragging Rebecca along. Frank noticed her subtle resistance, the way she tried to slow their pace without openly defying him. She was afraid, but she was also thinking, planning. His daughter had inherited more than just his stubbornness. "Dad?" Rebecca whispered as they passed the concierge desk. The word so soft Frank almost missed it. Their eyes met again, and this time there was no mistaking the recognition. 8 years melted away in an instant. She knew. Somehow, despite the uniform and the gray hair and the careful disguise, she knew. Frank's carefully maintained cover nearly shattered. Every paternal instinct he'd suppressed during years of classified missions roared to life. His little girl was in danger, carrying his grandchild, trapped with a man who just demonstrated his willingness to use violence in public. "Good night, sir," Frank managed, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside his chest. "I hope you both rest well." But as the elevator doors closed on Rebecca's frightened face, Commander Frank Walsh began planning an operation that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with family. The marble lobby returned to its usual evening ambience, but Frank remained motionless behind the concierge desk, his mind racing through tactical scenarios. Hotel security cameras had captured everything, but Jonathan's legal team would spin the narrative. Wealthy men like him rarely face consequences for private domestic matters. Tommy Rodriguez, his 26-year-old surveillance partner posing as a fellow bellhop, approached with studied casualness. "Everything all right, Frank? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Frank replied, his gaze still fixed on the elevator display, showing the car stopping at the 15th floor. "Penthouse suite, of course." "That was ugly," Tommy continued, glancing around to ensure no guests were listening. "Guy's got serious anger issues. Should we call local PD?" Frank shook his head. "Jonathan Cross has half the police department in his pocket. Besides, we can't blow our cover 24 hours before the final exchange." But even as he said the words, Frank knew the mission parameters had just changed completely. Tomorrow night, Jonathan would meet with his foreign contacts to transfer classified defense information worth millions. The evidence would finally be sufficient for federal charges: treason, espionage, conspiracy. Tonight, however, Frank's daughter was alone with a violent man who just demonstrated his willingness to hurt a pregnant woman in public. The sound of that slap echoed in his memory, mixing with 8 years of regret and missed opportunities. He'd chosen duty over family so many times that Rebecca had stopped expecting him to show up. Her wedding, her mother's funeral, countless birthdays and holidays sacrificed for classified missions. Now duty and family had collided in the marble lobby of a five-star hotel, and Frank realized some choices couldn't be postponed until the mission was complete. His daughter needed him. Tonight. The elevator chimed softly as another car arrived in the lobby, disgorging a group of business travelers. Frank straightened his uniform and resumed his role, but his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and contingencies. Commander Frank Walsh had never failed a mission in 25 years of service. But this wasn't just another operation. This was personal. "You chose your career over your family." Those were the last words Rebecca had spoken to her father, screamed through tears beside her mother's grave 8 years ago. Frank had arrived 20 minutes late to the funeral, still wearing his dress blues from an emergency briefing that couldn't wait. Classified mission, national security, always something more important than family. Now, as Jonathan dragged her through the penthouse suite's marble entryway, Rebecca's mind reeled from seeing her father's face after so many years. He looked older, worn down by decades of military service, but those steel gray eyes were unmistakable. What was he doing here? Why was he dressed as hotel staff? "Sit down," Jonathan commanded, gesturing toward the cream leather sofa that dominated the suite's living area. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city's glittering skyline, but Rebecca barely noticed the view. Her cheeks still stung from his slap, and the baby was moving restlessly, as if sensing her elevated stress levels. Jonathan poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon from the suite's premium bar, not offering her anything. Controlled through small gestures, she'd learned to recognize all his tactics over the past 3 years of marriage. "That little scene downstairs was unacceptable," he said, settling into the opposite chair like a king addressing a subject. "Peterson's contract represents $47 million in government revenue. Your thoughtless comment about his wife could have cost us everything. Rebecca pressed her hand to her swollen belly, feeling the baby's strong kicks against her palm. 7 months along, and she still couldn't believe she was bringing a child into this toxic environment. The pregnancy had been unplanned, a broken condom that Jonathan claimed was intentional sabotage on her part. "I didn't know about his wife," she said quietly. "You never tell me anything about your business partners." "Because you don't need to know," Jonathan replied, his tone suggesting this was obvious. "Your job is to look beautiful, smile when spoken to, and avoid embarrassing me. Simple enough, wouldn't you think?" The familiar pattern of humiliation washed over her. Jonathan was brilliant at making her feel stupid, worthless, completely dependent on his approval. When they'd first met 4 years ago, she'd been a successful marketing executive with her own apartment and a thriving social life. Now she felt like a ghost of that person. Marriage to Jonathan had meant leaving her job. He'd insisted she didn't need to work. It meant cutting ties with friends who didn't understand their dynamic. It meant moving across the country to his hometown, far from anyone who remembered the confident woman she used to be. Her phone buzzed and Jonathan's attention snapped to the device like a predator sensing movement. "Give it to me," he said, extending his hand with casual authority. "It's probably just spam," Rebecca replied, knowing resistance would only escalate his anger, but unable to stop herself. "The phone, Rebecca." She handed it over, watching as he scrolled through her recent messages with the thoroughness of a detective examining evidence. There wasn't much to find. He'd systematically isolated her from everyone who might offer support or outside perspective. "Lisa again," he said, referring to his sister-in-law. "Still trying to fill your head with feminist nonsense about independence and self-worth." Lisa was Rebecca's one remaining lifeline, though even that relationship required careful navigation. Jonathan tolerated his brother's wife because cutting off all family contact would raise questions he preferred to avoid. "She's just being friendly," Rebecca said. "She's being subversive," Jonathan corrected, pocketing the phone. "Lisa never approved of our marriage. She thinks you settled for security instead of following your dreams." Sonri. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to hurt. Rebecca had been drawn to Jonathan's success, his confidence, his ability to make decisions without second-guessing himself. After years of watching her father choose military duty over family, she'd craved a partner who would prioritize their relationship. She'd mistaken control for commitment. "I want you to stop talking to her," Jonathan continued, "at least until after the baby arrives. You need to focus on becoming a mother, not entertaining your sister-in-law's radical ideas about women's liberation." Rebecca felt the familiar surge of panic that accompanied his increasingly restrictive demands. First, it had been friends from college, then former coworkers, now family members. The isolation was complete, deliberate, and terrifying. "Jonathan, please," she began, then stopped. Arguing would only make things worse. "Please what?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Please let you maintain relationships that undermine our marriage? Please enable behavior that embarrasses me in public? Please ignore the fact that you're carrying my child and should be focused entirely on that responsibility." The baby kicked hard, as if responding to the tension in her voice. Rebecca had read that unborn children could sense their mother's stress levels, that chronic anxiety could affect development. The guilt was overwhelming. She was failing her child before it was even born. Standing 15 floors below, Frank used his master key access to reach the service elevator, his mind calculating angles and possibilities. The hotel's security system included audio monitoring of the penthouse level, supposedly for VIP protection. Frank had installed additional surveillance equipment during his months of monitoring Jonathan's activities. His daughter's voice came through the hidden microphones with heartbreaking clarity. She sounded small, defeated, nothing like the spirited young woman who'd challenged him at every opportunity during her teenage years. Marriage to Jonathan Cross had systematically dismantled her confidence and independence. Tommy's voice crackled through Frank's nearly invisible earpiece. "Target's phones are showing increased activity. 3 calls to his legal team in the past 10 minutes. Frank frowned. Jonathan's lawyers weren't supposed to be involved until after tomorrow night's meeting, unless he suspected surveillance. "Any mention of federal investigation?" Frank whispered, positioning himself in the service corridor where hotel guests wouldn't overhear. Negative. Seems focused on damage control from the lobby incident. Apparently someone posted video on social media. Of course, in today's world, public domestic violence rarely stayed private. Frank felt a surge of hope. Maybe the exposure would force Jonathan to moderate his behavior, at least temporarily. Back in the penthouse suite, Jonathan's phone rang. He answered on the first ring, his voice immediately shifting to the smooth professional tone he used for business calls. "Marcus, I was expecting your call," he said, moving toward the windows overlooking the city. "Yes, there was a minor incident, but it's being handled." Rebecca strained to hear the other side of the conversation, but Jonathan kept his voice low. She caught fragments: social media containment and reputation management and the Peterson contract. Fear settled in her stomach like ice water. Jonathan's business empire was built on carefully managed public image. Any threat to that image would be eliminated with ruthless efficiency. "I understand the concerns," Jonathan continued, "but I assure you, this won't affect tomorrow night's arrangement. Everything proceeds as planned." Tomorrow night. Rebecca had noticed Jonathan's increased tension over the past week. The way he'd been taking calls at odd hours and reviewing documents he quickly hid when she entered his office. Something important was happening, something he considered more valuable than his marriage or his unborn child. "The transfer will happen exactly as discussed," Jonathan said, his back still turned to Rebecca. "47 million in advanced defense technology, delivered as promised. My personal situation doesn't affect our business relationship." The words sent chills down Rebecca's spine. Defense technology? Transfer? This sounded like the kind of business dealings that existed in gray areas of legality, the kind that attracted federal attention. Was her father investigating Jonathan's business activities? Was his presence at the hotel purely coincidental, or was he here in some professional capacity? Jonathan ended the call and turned back to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That was about damage control," he said casually. "The video from tonight is already being scrubbed from social media. Amazing how quickly problems disappear when you have the right connections." The implication was clear. Rebecca's moment of public visibility would vanish as if it never happened. No one would believe her story, no one would investigate further, and Jonathan would continue operating with complete impunity. "Now," he continued, settling back into his chair, "let's discuss how we prevent future embarrassments, starting with that phone of yours." He pulled out her device and began scrolling through her contacts with surgical precision. "Delete," he said, tapping the screen. "Delete, delete." Rebecca watched helplessly as he eliminated her remaining connections to the outside world, one name at a time. Friends, former colleagues, distant relatives, all erased with casual efficiency. "This is for your own good," Jonathan explained, his tone suggesting he genuinely believed the words. "You need to focus on our family, not maintaining relationships that pull your attention in different directions." When he finished, only 3 contacts remained: Jonathan, his office, and emergency services. "There," he said with satisfaction, "much cleaner. Now you can concentrate on what really matters." 15 floors below, Frank listened to his daughter's increasingly desperate situation through the surveillance equipment that was supposed to be gathering evidence against her husband. The irony was crushing. He had all the tools necessary to monitor Jonathan's criminal activities, but he was powerless to protect Rebecca from immediate harm, unless he was willing to blow his cover and sacrifice 8 months of investigation. Unless he was willing to choose family over duty for the first time in his military career. The decision was becoming less difficult with each passing minute. Frank Walsh stared at the classified files spread across his cramped hotel room desk, but the words blurred together as his daughter's voice echoed through his surveillance equipment. Commander Frank Walsh, not Frank Wilson, Bellhop, but the decorated naval intelligence officer who'd spent 8 months building an airtight case against Jonathan Cross. The real mission had nothing to do with domestic violence and everything to do with national security. Jonathan wasn't just an abusive husband, he was a traitor selling advanced defense technology to foreign adversaries, using his legitimate government contracts as cover for espionage activities worth hundreds of millions. "Tommy," Frank said into his secure radio, "meet me in my room. We need to reassess the situation." 20 minutes later, Tommy Rodriguez knocked twice. paused, then knocked once. Their established signal. Frank opened the door to find his partner carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who knew the mission had just become infinitely more complicated. "So that was your daughter," Tommy said, settling into the room's single chair. At 26, he was young enough to be Frank's son, but Navy intelligence had paired them because of Tommy's natural ability to blend into civilian environments. "The pregnant woman getting slapped around by our primary target." "Yeah," Frank replied, the word carrying 8 years of regret and missed opportunities. Tommy studied the files scattered across the desk: financial records, communication intercepts, photographic evidence of meetings with known foreign agents. "This is a hell of a situation, Commander. Your daughter married the guy we've been investigating for treason." Frank had been asking himself the same questions for the past 2 hours. How had Rebecca ended up with Jonathan Cross? Why hadn't his background checks during the early stages of their relationship revealed her father's identity? How had a Navy intelligence commander's daughter become the wife of a man selling American military secrets? "She didn't know," Frank said, more to convince himself than Tommy. "There's no way Rebecca would knowingly marry someone involved in espionage." "Maybe not," Tommy agreed, "but she's definitely involved now. She lives in his house, has access to his communications, attends his business meetings. From an operational perspective, she's a potential asset." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. His pregnant daughter wasn't just an abuse victim. She was an unwitting participant in activities that could land her in federal prison. Even if prosecutors believed she was innocent, the investigation would destroy what remained of her life. "Walk me through tomorrow night," Frank said, needing to focus on tactical realities rather than emotional chaos. Tommy consulted his tablet, pulling up their operational timeline. Peterson arrives at 8 p.m. with the technical specifications. Jonathan transfers $47 million in cryptocurrency to the designated accounts. Peterson uploads the defense data to secure servers controlled by foreign intelligence services. We arrest everyone involved and seize all evidence. What about Rebecca? She'll be in the suite during the exchange. Jonathan never lets her leave during his important meetings. Tommy paused, recognizing the implication. She'll be arrested along with everyone else. Standard procedure. Frank's hands clenched into fists. 8 months of surveillance had revealed Jonathan's pattern. He kept Rebecca close during sensitive business activities, using her presence as both a cover and a form of control. To outside observers, they looked like a normal, wealthy couple entertaining business associates. In reality, Rebecca was a hostage. "There has to be another way," Frank said. "Commander, with respect, we've been planning this operation for months. The evidence is overwhelming, the timing is perfect, and we finally have Jonathan dead to rights on treason charges. We can't compromise the mission because of personal involvement." Tommy was right, and Frank knew it. Military justice was about serving the greater good, protecting national interests, maintaining operational discipline even when personal feelings conflicted with duty. It was the same logic that had kept Frank away from family gatherings, school plays, Christmas mornings, and funeral services. The same logic that had cost him his relationship with his daughter. "What if she cooperates?" Frank asked. "What if Rebecca provides additional evidence against Jonathan?" Tommy raised an eyebrow. "You want to turn your daughter into an informant against her husband, the father of her child?" The idea was morally complicated but strategically sound. Rebecca had access to Jonathan's private communications, his home office, his personal routines. She could provide intelligence that would strengthen their case while potentially earning immunity from prosecution. "She's already a victim," Frank reasoned. "This would give her some control over the situation." "Or it would put her in incredible danger," Tommy countered. "If Jonathan suspects she's feeding information to federal investigators, domestic violence becomes the least of her problems. We're talking about people who commit treason for money. They won't hesitate to eliminate a witness." Frank's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from their handler at Navy Intelligence Headquarters. The text was brief but clear. "Operation Greenlight confirmed for 2100 hours. No changes to mission parameters. Tomorrow night at 9 p.m., 8 months of investigation would culminate in arrests that would make national headlines. Jonathan Cross, wealthy tech CEO and pillar of the community, would be exposed as a traitor who sold American defense secrets to hostile foreign governments. His pregnant wife would be collateral damage. There's something else, Tommy said, pulling up a different file on his tablet. Financial analysis shows Rebecca has been researching divorce attorneys. Frank leaned forward, studying the screen. Bank records showed searches for legal services, consultation fees paid to 3 different law firms, retainer agreements that were started but never completed. She's been trying to leave him, Frank said, feeling a surge of pride in his daughter's courage. But she keeps backing out. Look at the timeline. Every time she gets close to filing papers, the payments stop and the communications end. Frank studied the pattern, recognizing the cycle that traps so many abuse victims. Hope, followed by fear, followed by resignation, followed by renewed hope. Rebecca had been fighting for her freedom, but Jonathan's control tactics were winning. The pregnancy complicated everything, Tommy observed. Hard to start over with a newborn and no financial independence? Frank's surveillance equipment crackled to life, transmitting sound from the penthouse suite 15 floors above. Rebecca's voice was barely audible, but her words sent ice through his veins. Please, Jonathan, I can't breathe. Tommy was on his feet immediately, reaching for his weapon. We need to move, now. But Frank held up a restraining hand, listening to the full context. Rebecca was lying down, and Jonathan was adjusting pillows behind her back. The breathing difficulty was pregnancy-related, not violence-related. False alarm, Frank said, but his heart was still racing. She's fine. For now, Tommy replied grimly. But this situation is escalating fast. The slap in the lobby was public, reckless. He's losing control, which makes him more dangerous. Frank knew Tommy was right. Domestic abusers typically escalated their violence when they felt their control slipping. Jonathan's business empire was under federal investigation. His wife was researching divorce options, and now there was video evidence of his abusive behavior circulating online. Men like Jonathan Cross didn't accept loss of control gracefully. I need to talk to her, Frank said. Absolutely not. Any contact blows your cover and compromises the entire operation. She recognized me tonight. She whispered Dad when they walked past the concierge desk. Tommy's expression shifted from concern to alarm. You think she'll expose you? Frank shook his head. Rebecca's angry with me, but she's not stupid. She knows something's wrong with this situation, and she's smart enough to figure out that I'm here for reasons beyond coincidence. Smart enough to help us? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Frank had spent 8 years respecting Rebecca's decision to cut him out of her life. He'd honored her boundaries, accepted that his choice to prioritize military duty had cost him his relationship with his daughter. But now she was in danger, carrying his grandchild, trapped with a man who posed threats to both personal safety and national security. Some missions were worth the risk. Some families were worth fighting for. Set up a secure communication channel, Frank ordered, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in command. I need to contact Rebecca without Jonathan's knowledge. Tommy hesitated. Commander, this violates every operational protocol we have. Then we create new protocols, Frank replied. Because tomorrow night, we're not just arresting a traitor. We're saving my daughter. At 2 a.m., Rebecca lay awake in the king-size bed, listening to Jonathan's steady breathing beside her. The baby was restless tonight, shifting and kicking as if sensing her anxiety. 7 months pregnant, and she felt like she was carrying the weight of the world instead of just her child. Her phone, the one Jonathan thought he'd completely controlled, buzzed softly under her pillow. She'd hidden her old device months ago when his surveillance became overwhelming, keeping it charged and functional for emergencies. The incoming message was from an unknown number, but the words made her heart stop. Lighthouse, seashells, captain's daughter. If you remember these words, respond with the color of Mom's favorite flowers. Rebecca's hands shook as she read the message 3 times. Lighthouse, the nickname her father had given her when she was 5, after she'd insisted on staying up late to guide him home safely from deployment. Seashells, their tradition of collecting them during rare family vacations to the coast. Captain's daughter, what he'd called her when she displayed the stubborn leadership qualities that ran in their family. Only her father would know those specific details. With trembling fingers, she typed back, "Purple. Always purple." The response came immediately. "Meet me in the hotel garden at 6 a.m. Come alone. Trust me, Lighthouse." Rebecca stared at the screen until the words burned into her memory, then deleted both messages. Her father was here, working undercover, somehow connected to Jonathan's business activities. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. She'd always wondered how a small-town tech startup had become a multi-million-dollar defense contractor so quickly. Jonathan's rise had been meteoric, almost supernatural, built on government contracts that seemed to appear from nowhere. His meetings with foreign businessmen, the late-night phone calls in languages she didn't recognize, the cash payments that never appeared in their joint accounts. Her husband wasn't just controlling and abusive. He was probably a criminal, and her father was investigating him. At 5:30 a.m., Rebecca slipped out of bed with practiced silence. Jonathan was a heavy sleeper when he'd been drinking, and he'd consumed most of a bottle of bourbon after his mysterious phone calls the night before. She dressed quickly in loose-fitting clothes that accommodated her pregnancy, grabbed a hotel key card, and made her way to the elevator. The garden terrace was deserted at this early hour, shadows still long across the carefully manicured pathways. Rebecca found a bench near the fountain, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly as she waited. The morning air was cool and clean, such a contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the penthouse suite. "You came." She turned to find her father approaching from the shadows, no longer wearing the bellhop uniform. Instead, he was dressed in dark civilian clothes that somehow made him look more like the military officer she remembered. At 58, he was grayer and more weathered, but his posture was unmistakably command-level Navy. "Dad," she whispered, the word carrying 8 years of hurt and confusion and desperate hope. They stared at each other across the garden space, neither sure how to bridge the gap that had separated them for so long. Rebecca had imagined this reunion countless times, but never under circumstances like these. "You look," Frank began, then stopped. "How did you tell your estranged daughter that she looked beautiful and terrified, and somehow exactly like her mother had when she was pregnant?" "Different," Rebecca finished. "Beaten down. Controlled, I know." Frank moved closer, his trained eye cataloging the subtle signs of abuse. The way she held herself defensively, the careful positioning that protected her belly, the nervous glances toward the hotel entrance. "Rebecca, I need you to know that I'm here professionally, but what I saw last night changed everything. You're in danger, and so is your baby." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You think I don't know that? I've been researching divorce attorneys for months, but every time I get close to leaving, something happens. He finds the documents, or he threatens legal action, or he reminds me that I have no money, no job, no place to go." "You have family," Frank said quietly. "Do I?" The question was sharp with 8 years of accumulated pain. Where was my family when Mom was dying? Where was my family at my wedding? Where was my family when I needed support and guidance, and someone to tell me that controlling behavior wasn't the same as love? Frank absorbed the words like physical blows, because they were all true. He had failed her at every critical moment, always prioritizing mission over family, duty over daughter. "You're right," he said. "I wasn't there when you needed me, but I'm here now. Are you here as my father, or as whatever kind of agent you are?" The question cut to the heart of Frank's internal conflict. "Both," he admitted. "Your husband is involved in activities that threaten national security. Tomorrow night, we're arresting him on federal charges." Rebecca felt the world tilt around her. What kind of charges? Treason, espionage, conspiracy to transfer classified defense information to foreign adversaries. The words hit her like successive waves. Her husband wasn't just abusive, he was a traitor. Her child would grow up with a father in federal prison, assuming she could even escape the legal fallout. "How long have you been investigating him?" 8 months. I've been working undercover at this hotel, monitoring his activities, building evidence for prosecution." 8 months. Rebecca's mind raced through the timeline. 8 months ago, Jonathan had insisted they take a more active role in his business entertaining. 8 months ago, he'd moved his most sensitive meetings to this specific hotel. 8 months ago, her isolation had intensified as he demanded her presence at increasingly suspicious gatherings. He's been using me, she realized, as cover. A pregnant wife makes him look stable, trustworthy, family-oriented. Frank nodded grimly. That's our assessment. Your presence at these meetings makes them appear social rather than criminal, which means I could be charged as an accomplice. Not if you cooperate with the investigation. The suggestion hung between them like a bridge across 8 years of silence. Rebecca could help her father build the case against Jonathan, potentially earning immunity while ensuring her husband faced justice for his crimes. What would cooperation look like? Frank outlined the basics, providing access to Jonathan's communications, documenting his business activities, wearing recording equipment during tomorrow night's meeting. It would be dangerous, requiring her to maintain the pretense of a loyal wife while gathering evidence that could send Jonathan to prison for life. If he suspects me, Rebecca began, we'll have surveillance on you at all times. The moment we sense any threat, we extract you from the situation. And after, assuming we survive this? Frank met her eyes with the steady gaze that had carried him through decades of military service. After we rebuild, we figure out how to be a family again. We make sure your child grows up knowing both parents love them unconditionally. Rebecca felt tears building for the first time since the slap in the lobby. The combination of pregnancy hormones, chronic stress, and unexpected hope was overwhelming. I don't know if I can trust you, she whispered. You've disappointed me so many times. Then trust the mission, Frank replied. Trust that stopping Jonathan serves both justice and your personal safety. Trust that sometimes duty and family point in the same direction. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to the emotional intensity of the conversation. Rebecca placed both hands on her belly, feeling the strong, steady movements of her child fighting for space and recognition. If I do this, she said slowly, I need guarantees. Protection, immunity, and a new life for me and the baby. Done. I need to know that you won't disappear again when the mission is over. Frank hesitated, recognizing the weight of the promise she was requesting. Military life was unpredictable, full of classified assignments and extended deployments. But looking at his daughter, really seeing her for the first time in 8 years, he realized that some commitments mattered more than others. I'll request shore duty, he said, assignment to a position that keeps me stateside, available for family obligations. You'd give up your career advancement? I'd choose my family over my career. For the first time in my life, I'd make the right choice. Rebecca studied her father's face, searching for the sincerity she'd craved during childhood. Military bearing made him hard to read, but she could see something in his eyes that looked like genuine regret and determination. Okay, she said finally, tell me what I need to do. At 8:15 p.m. the following evening, Rebecca sat in the penthouse suite's elegant dining room, wearing a maternity dress that concealed the recording equipment Frank's team had carefully positioned earlier that day. The wire was so sophisticated, it was virtually undetectable, but she could feel its weight like a constant reminder of the dangerous game she was playing. Jonathan emerged from his office wearing his most expensive suit, the one he reserved for meetings that could change his life. His mood had been strange all day, excited, nervous, almost giddy with anticipation. Whatever business he was conducting tonight represented the culmination of months of planning. Peterson should arrive any moment, he said, straightening his tie with the precision of a man accustomed to controlling every detail. Remember what we discussed about your role tonight? Rebecca nodded, playing the part of the obedient wife she'd perfected over 3 years of marriage. Smile, stay quiet, and make our guests feel welcome. Exactly. This is the most important business meeting of my career, Rebecca. Everything we've worked for comes down to the next 2 hours. She almost laughed at the pronoun we, since she'd contributed nothing to Jonathan's business empire except her unwitting presence at criminal gatherings. But maintaining her cover required perfect submission to his expectations. The penthouse doorbell chimed with expensive precision. Jonathan checked his appearance one final time, then opened the door to reveal a distinguished man in his 50s, accompanied by a younger woman who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Peterson, Jonathan said with practiced warmth, extending his hand. Right on time. Cross, Peterson replied, his accent revealing Eastern European origins. I trust everything is prepared for our transaction? Absolutely, please come in. Shiamonturum. Rebecca rose from her chair with the careful movement of someone 7 months pregnant, offering the polite smile that had become her default expression in social situations. This is my wife, Rebecca, Jonathan said. Darling, this is Mr. Peterson and his associate, Miss Volkov? Volkov, yes, the woman confirmed, her English heavily accented. She appeared to be in her 30s, attractive in a cold, professional way that suggested she was more than just Peterson's companion. As the group settled into the living area, Rebecca served drinks and appetizers while listening to the careful conversation that danced around the real purpose of the meeting. Jonathan and Peterson discussed weather, hotel amenities, and vague business opportunities while Miss Volkov remained silent, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the room. 15 floors below, Frank monitored the audio feed while coordinating with Tommy and their backup team. The conversation was proceeding exactly as they'd anticipated. Cautious preliminaries leading to the actual exchange of classified materials. Phoenix is in position, came the radio report from their sniper, positioned on an adjacent building with visual access to the penthouse windows. All subjects clearly visible. Eagle team ready for entry, reported their tactical unit, stationed in the hotel's service corridors, awaiting final authorization. Frank checked his watch. 8:27 p.m. Based on months of surveillance, the actual transfer would begin around 9 o'clock, giving them sufficient evidence to make arrests on treason charges. In the penthouse suite, the conversation was shifting toward business specifics. Peterson opened an expensive briefcase, revealing sophisticated electronic equipment that Rebecca didn't recognize but suspected was related to military applications. The technical specifications you requested, Peterson said, connecting a tablet to what appeared to be a secure server. Advanced missile guidance systems, radar jamming capabilities, and encryption protocols currently used by NATO forces. Jonathan's eyes gleamed with undisguised greed as he reviewed the information on the tablet screen. This is exactly what our clients have been requesting. Revolutionary technology that will change the balance of power in several ongoing conflicts. Rebecca felt sick to her stomach, realizing that her husband was selling weapons technology that would be used against American forces and their allies. The baby seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly as her stress levels spiked. The payment is ready for transfer, Jonathan continued, moving to his laptop. 47 million in cryptocurrency, distributed across the accounts we discussed. Ms. Volkov spoke for the first time since arriving. Before payment, we need confirmation that this information is authentic, not fabricated or outdated. Of course, Jonathan replied smoothly. I have test results from our recent field trials, conducted with the full cooperation of certain Pentagon officials who share our vision of international defense cooperation. The casual mention of Pentagon corruption made Rebecca's blood run cold. How many people were involved in Jonathan's treason? How deep did this conspiracy extend into the government agencies tasked with protecting national security? Frank's voice crackled through her nearly invisible earpiece. Rebecca, we need visual confirmation of the data transfer. Can you position yourself where you can see Peterson's screen? Moving carefully, Rebecca refilled wine glasses while angling herself to observe the tablet display. The screen showed technical diagrams, mathematical equations, and test data that was clearly classified material. Information that could cost lives if it fell into the wrong hands. Beautiful work, Peterson murmured, studying the specifications with professional appreciation. Our clients will be very pleased with this intelligence. Payment first, Jonathan insisted, his finger hovering over the laptop keyboard. Once I confirm receipt of the cryptocurrency, you receive full access to the technical database. This was the moment Frank's team had been waiting for, the actual exchange of money for classified information captured on audio and video surveillance. Federal prosecutors would have everything they needed to secure treason convictions against everyone in the room. Peterson nodded to Miss Volkov, who produced her own laptop and began typing rapidly. Within minutes, Jonathan's secure accounts showed incoming transfers totaling $47 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. Confirmed, Jonathan said with obvious satisfaction. Payment received in full. He entered a complex password into his laptop, then transferred complete access to the classified database to Peterson's secure server. Years of American military research, stolen and sold to foreign adversaries for financial profit. Excellent, Peterson said, closing his briefcase with the careful movements of someone handling extremely valuable cargo. Our business relationship has been most profitable, Mr. Cross. I trust future opportunities will prove equally beneficial. That's when the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in immediately, bathing the suite in red security lighting that made everyone look like figures in a horror movie. The building's fire alarm began shrieking with deafening intensity. "What the hell?" Jonathan began, but his words were cut off by the sound of the penthouse door exploding inward. Frank emerged from the smoke wearing full military dress uniform instead of his bellhop disguise, flanked by tactical officers in Navy intelligence gear. His decorated chest caught the emergency lighting as he stepped into the room with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Step away from my daughter," he ordered, his voice carrying 25 years of military authority. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Peterson reached for what appeared to be a weapon, but Frank's team was already in position. Miss Volkov tried to destroy evidence on her laptop, but tactical officers secured all electronic equipment before she could complete the process. Jonathan stared at Frank with the expression of someone watching his entire world collapse in real time. "You're her father? You're military intelligence?" "Commander Frank Walsh, Navy Intelligence," Frank replied, producing federal arrest warrants. "Jonathan Cross, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy to transfer classified information to foreign adversaries, and violations of the Espionage Act." As tactical officers moved to secure the suspects, Rebecca felt her water break. The stress, the fear, the adrenaline rush of watching her husband arrested for treason, it all triggered the labor she'd been dreading for months. 8 weeks early, but her baby was ready to enter a world where his father was going to federal prison and his mother was finally truly free. "Frank," Rebecca gasped, reaching for her father's hand as contractions began. "The baby's coming." Everything else, the arrests, the evidence, the national security implications, suddenly became secondary to the most important mission of Frank's life: delivering his grandchild safely into the world. "Get me a medical team now," Frank shouted into his radio as Rebecca doubled over with another contraction. The penthouse suite had transformed into a crime scene, with federal agents processing evidence while his daughter went into active labor on the cream leather sofa. "Dad," Rebecca gasped between waves of pain. "Something's wrong. It's too early." At 32 weeks, the baby was viable, but would need immediate medical attention. Frank's tactical training kicked in as he assessed the situation. EMT response time from the ground floor would be at least 8 minutes, assuming they could navigate through the federal agents securing the building. "Tommy," Frank called to his partner, who was overseeing Jonathan's arrest, "I need you to coordinate with hotel security. Clear the fastest route for medical personnel." Jonathan, now handcuffed and flanked by federal agents, tried to approach Rebecca. "That's my child being born. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," Frank interrupted coldly. "Anything beyond that is a privilege you forfeited when you committed treason." Miss Volkov and Peterson were already being escorted to separate vehicles, their laptops and equipment secured as evidence. The classified information they'd purchased would never reach foreign adversaries, but the damage to national security was already significant. Rebecca's contractions intensified, coming every 2 minutes now. Frank had witnessed combat injuries, survived firefights, commanded operations under impossible pressure, but watching his daughter in pain was the most helpless he'd ever felt. "Frank," came a voice from the penthouse entrance. "Medical team's here, but we've got a problem." Dr. Sarah Chen, the Navy medical officer assigned to their tactical team, approached with her emergency kit. She was qualified to handle trauma injuries, but obstetrics wasn't her specialty. "How far along?" Dr. Chen asked, immediately assessing Rebecca's condition. 32 weeks, Rebecca managed between contractions. "Water broke about 10 minutes ago." "We need to get her to a hospital," Dr. Chen said. "Premature labor requires specialized equipment and neonatal intensive care." Frank coordinated with hotel management to clear elevator access, while Rebecca's labor progressed with frightening speed. At 32 weeks, babies could survive outside the womb, but they needed immediate medical intervention to handle breathing, feeding, and temperature regulation. Transport's going to take too long, Dr. Chen announced grimly. This baby is coming now. Frank found himself in the surreal situation of commanding a federal crime scene while his daughter delivered his grandchild in the middle of the evidence collection. Hotel manager Sarah Mitchell cleared the presidential suite of all non-essential personnel, transforming the luxurious space into an emergency delivery room. Rebecca, Frank said, kneeling beside the sofa where she was positioned for delivery, I need you to focus on my voice. Remember when you were little and got scared during thunderstorms? What did I tell you? Through her pain, Rebecca smiled at the memory. Sailors don't fear storms. They learn to navigate through them. That's right, Lighthouse. This is just another storm, and you're the strongest sailor I know. Dr. Chen worked with professional efficiency, monitoring Rebecca's vital signs while preparing for a delivery that was happening much faster than anyone had anticipated. I can see the head. Rebecca, on the next contraction, I need you to push. The sound of federal agents processing evidence faded into background noise as Frank held his daughter's hand and watched his grandchild enter the world. After 8 years of silence, 8 months of investigation, and 8 hours of crisis, their family was finally coming together. One more push, Dr. Chen encouraged. Chen. Rebecca bore down with strength that reminded Frank of her mother during her own difficult labor 29 years ago. Strong women, both of them, capable of enduring incredible pain to bring life into the world. The baby emerged with a cry that filled the penthouse suite. Healthy lungs, demanding attention, very much alive despite arriving 8 weeks ahead of schedule. It's a girl, Dr. Chen announced, immediately beginning the assessment procedures necessary for premature infants. 5 pounds, 2 ounces, good color, strong reflexes, breathing independently. Frank watched his granddaughter receive her first medical care, while Rebecca collapsed back against the sofa cushions with exhaustion and relief. The baby was small but fighting, waving tiny fists as if protesting the dramatic circumstances of her arrival. She's beautiful, Frank whispered, overcome by emotions he'd spent decades learning to control. Absolutely perfect. Rebecca reached for her daughter with trembling hands, cradling the small body against her chest. Hello, baby girl. I'm your mama. I'm sorry you had to arrive during all this chaos, but we're going to be okay now. From across the room, Jonathan's voice carried desperate anger. That's my daughter, too. I have parental rights. Frank turned to face the man who'd terrorized his child for 3 years, his military bearing radiating authority and barely controlled fury. You're going to federal prison for the rest of your life. You'll never have contact with this child again. You can't do that. I'm her biological father. You're a traitor who sold military secrets to foreign adversaries, Frank replied coldly. The only right you have is to legal representation. Dr. Chen finished her initial assessment of the baby, wrapping her in thermal blankets to maintain body temperature. She needs neonatal care, but her vital signs are strong, premature but healthy. As EMTs arrived with specialized equipment for transporting premature infants, Frank realized that this moment represented the intersection of every choice he'd made over the past 8 years. His decision to prioritize duty over family had cost him his relationship with Rebecca. His investigation of Jonathan Cross had revealed the danger she was living with. His choice to blow his cover had saved both his daughter and his grandchild. What's her name? Frank asked as medical personnel prepared Rebecca and the baby for transport to the hospital. Rebecca looked down at her daughter, then up at her father with eyes that held both forgiveness and hope. Hope. Her name is Hope Walsh. Walsh, not Cross. She was giving the baby Frank's family name, symbolically cutting ties with Jonathan's legacy of violence and treason. Hope Walsh, Frank repeated, feeling something inside his chest that had been frozen for years finally begin to thaw. That's perfect. As they prepared to leave the crime scene that had become a delivery room, Frank realized that some missions had outcomes more valuable than successful operations. Some victories were measured in heartbeats and tiny fingers, and the chance to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of choosing duty over love. His granddaughter would grow up knowing that her grandfather had saved her mother from danger, that family could overcome any obstacle, and that love was worth fighting for. The mission was complete, but the most important work was just beginning. 3 days after Hope's dramatic arrival, Rebecca sat in the neonatal intensive care unit, watching her daughter fight the challenges of premature birth with the same stubborn determination that ran in their family. At 5 pounds and steadily growing, Hope was exceeding every medical expectation, but she'd need to remain hospitalized for several more weeks. Frank had barely left the hospital since the delivery, splitting his time between NICU visits and federal debriefings about the Jonathan Cross investigation. The arrest had made national headlines. Tech CEO arrested for selling military secrets. But the full scope of Jonathan's treason was still emerging as investigators analyzed the evidence. That's when Jonathan's legal team launched their counterattack. "Mrs. Cross," said Margaret Whitfield, the expensive attorney who'd appeared at Rebecca's hospital bedside without invitation, "my client is deeply concerned about his daughter's well-being and would like to discuss visitation arrangements." Rebecca looked up from Hope's incubator with exhaustion and disbelief. "Your client is in federal custody awaiting trial for treason. Those charges are being vigorously disputed," Whitfield replied smoothly. "Mr. Cross maintains that his business dealings were legitimate international commerce and that evidence against him was obtained through illegal surveillance conducted by your father." Frank arrived at that moment, carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent too many hours dealing with federal prosecutors. He took one look at Whitfield and immediately shifted into protective mode. "Ma'am, you need to leave," Frank said with quiet authority. "My daughter is recovering from emergency childbirth, and this is not an appropriate venue for legal discussions." "Commander Walsh, I presume," Whitfield said, extending her manicured hand. "I'm representing Mr. Cross in both his criminal defense and his parental rights case. I believe we have much to discuss." Frank didn't shake her hand. "Jonathan Cross has no parental rights. He's been charged with treason." "Alleged treason," Whitfield corrected, "and even if those charges were valid, they wouldn't automatically terminate parental rights. That requires a separate legal proceeding, which my client intends to contest vigorously." Rebecca felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized the legal nightmare she was facing. Jonathan might be in federal custody, but his wealth could fund an aggressive legal battle that would drag on for months or years. "What does he want?" Rebecca asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Joint custody when he's released on bail, full visitation rights during any pretrial period, and he wants the child's name changed from Walsh to Cross, as is appropriate for his biological daughter." The demands were precisely calculated to terrorize Rebecca into submission. Even from prison, Jonathan was finding ways to control and manipulate her life. "Absolutely not," Frank said firmly. "He's a danger to both my daughter and my granddaughter." "According to whom?" Whitfield asked. "The domestic violence allegations are based entirely on hearsay and a single incident that could be explained as marital stress during a difficult pregnancy." Frank's jaw clenched as he recognized the legal strategy. Jonathan's team would paint the hotel slap as an isolated incident, the result of business pressure and marital tension, rather than systematic abuse. Without extensive documentation of previous violence, proving a pattern would be difficult. "There's video evidence," Rebecca said, "which shows one regrettable moment during what was clearly a stressful evening for both parties," Whitfield replied. "Hardly evidence of ongoing domestic violence, especially considering your decision to remain married and living with my client for months afterward." The victim blaming was expertly deployed, designed to make Rebecca question her own memories and experiences. Why hadn't she left sooner? Why hadn't she documented the abuse? Why had she stayed if she was really in danger? "Ms. Whitfield," Frank said, his military training helping him maintain composure, "your client was arrested while selling classified military information to foreign adversaries. He's facing life in prison for treason." "Alleged treason," Whitfield repeated, "and those charges are based on evidence obtained through an illegal surveillance operation conducted by Rebecca's father, who had personal motivations for targeting my client. The legal attack was sophisticated and dangerous. Jonathan's attorneys were arguing that Frank's undercover investigation was compromised by personal bias, making the evidence inadmissible in federal court. If they succeeded, the treason charges could be dismissed, and Jonathan would be free to pursue custody of Hope. There's something else, Whitfield continued, producing a thick legal document. My client is requesting immediate DNA testing to confirm paternity, and he wants Rebecca's medical records from the pregnancy to ensure there are no questions about the child's biological father. Rebecca's hands shook as she realized the full scope of Jonathan's legal assault. He was questioning whether Hope was even his child, creating doubt that could complicate any custody proceedings while forcing Rebecca to endure invasive medical examinations. "Get out," Frank said, his voice carrying the barely controlled fury of a father protecting his family. "Now." "Commander, I understand you're emotional about this situation, but threats won't change the legal realities. My client has constitutional rights, including the right to see his daughter." After Whitfield left, Frank and Rebecca sat in silence beside Hope's incubator, watching their tiny fighter sleep peacefully despite the chaos surrounding her birth. "Can he really get custody?" Rebecca asked. Frank had been asking himself the same question while coordinating with Navy legal counsel and federal prosecutors. The answer was more complicated than he wanted to admit. "It depends on whether the treason charges stick," Frank said. "If Jonathan's attorneys succeed in getting the evidence suppressed, he could be released pending trial. At that point, family court would have to consider his custody petition. Even knowing he's abusive? Proving systematic domestic violence without extensive documentation is challenging. The hotel incident was public, but his lawyers will argue it was an isolated event caused by business stress." Rebecca felt the familiar panic that had characterized her marriage to Jonathan, the sense that no matter what she did, he would find a way to maintain control. Even from federal custody, he was manipulating the legal system to terrorize her into submission. "There has to be something we can do," she said. Frank had been thinking the same thing, reviewing every aspect of the investigation and arrest to ensure the evidence would withstand legal challenges. Jonathan's treason was clear and well documented, but his attorneys were skilled at creating reasonable doubt. "We need to strengthen the domestic violence case," Frank said. "Document everything, gather witness statements, build a timeline of controlling behavior that shows the hotel slap was part of a larger pattern." "Most of the abuse was psychological," Rebecca replied. "Isolation, financial control, constant criticism, hard to prove in court. Then we prove it through other evidence. Financial records showing how he controlled your access to money. Phone records showing how he monitored your communications. Testimony from people who witnessed his controlling behavior." Frank was applying military strategic thinking to a civilian legal battle, but the principles were similar. Gather intelligence, identify weaknesses, coordinate resources to achieve the objective. "What about the baby?" Rebecca asked, looking down at Hope's peaceful face. "We make sure she's protected no matter what happens with the legal proceedings. That means secure housing, financial independence, and support systems that Jonathan can't infiltrate or control." Frank's military connections would provide security resources, but Rebecca needed to rebuild the life and independence that 3 years of marriage to Jonathan had systematically destroyed. "I want to testify against him," Rebecca said suddenly, "in the treason trial. If his attorneys are going to argue that the evidence was compromised, I want to tell the jury exactly what kind of man he is." Frank nodded approvingly. "That's good strategy. Your testimony could help prosecutors contextualize his behavior and motivations. And it sends a message to him," Rebecca continued, "that I'm not afraid anymore, that I won't be controlled or silenced or intimidated into submission." Looking at his daughter holding their 3-day-old granddaughter, Frank felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with military accomplishments or successful operations. Rebecca was finding her strength again, preparing to fight for her child's future, with the same determination that had carried her through 8 years of estrangement and 3 years of abuse. The legal battle would be long and expensive and emotionally draining, but for the first time since Hope's birth, Frank believed they could win. 6 weeks after Hope's birth, Frank found himself sitting before a military tribunal convened to review his conduct during Operation Crosscurrent, the official designation for the investigation that had culminated in Jonathan's arrest and his granddaughter's dramatic delivery. The hearing room at Naval Intelligence Headquarters was sterile and formal, designed to emphasize the seriousness of military justice proceedings. Three senior officers sat behind an elevated bench, their ribbons and decorations reflecting decades of distinguished service. Frank recognized Admiral Patricia Morrison, the tribunal president, from previous classified briefings. Commander Walsh, Admiral Morrison began, this tribunal has been convened to examine allegations that personal interests compromised your professional judgment during a classified counterintelligence operation. How do you respond to these charges? Frank stood at attention, his dress uniform pressed to perfection despite the emotional chaos of the past 6 weeks. Admiral, I maintain that my actions were necessary to prevent imminent harm to civilian personnel while preserving the integrity of a critical national security investigation. The allegations against Frank were serious, that his discovery of Rebecca's relationship with Jonathan Cross had compromised his objectivity, that his decision to involve her as an informant violated operational protocols, and that his intervention during the arrest had prioritized family interests over mission success. Jonathan's defense team had filed formal complaints arguing that Frank's personal involvement invalidated the entire investigation. If the tribunal agreed, months of evidence could be suppressed, potentially allowing a traitor to escape prosecution. Let's review the timeline, said Colonel James Martinez, the tribunal's senior legal officer. You discovered the target's relationship to your estranged daughter approximately 48 hours before the planned arrest. Why didn't you immediately recuse yourself from the operation? Frank had anticipated this question during weeks of preparation with Navy legal counsel. Sir, removing myself from the operation at that critical juncture would have compromised 8 months of surveillance and intelligence gathering. I made a tactical decision to maintain operational continuity while ensuring civilian safety. By recruiting your daughter as an informant without proper authorization? By utilizing an available asset who had unique access to the target's activities and communications? Frank corrected. Rebecca Cross? He caught himself. Rebecca Walsh provided crucial intelligence that strengthened our evidence while potentially saving her own life. The formal language of military proceedings couldn't disguise the emotional reality of what Frank had experienced. Watching his daughter endure systematic abuse while building a case against her tormentor had tested every principle of professional distance and operational objectivity he'd learned in 25 years of service. Commander, Admiral Morrison interjected, the tribunal has reviewed extensive surveillance footage from the hotel operation. We've also examined the classified materials seized during Mr. Cross's arrest. The evidence of treason appears overwhelming. Frank felt a surge of hope. If the tribunal focused on the strength of the evidence, rather than the circumstances of its collection, Jonathan's conviction would be assured. However, Morrison continued, we must also consider whether your personal involvement compromised the legal admissibility of that evidence. Defense attorneys are arguing that your bias tainted the entire investigation. This was the crux of the case against Frank, whether his love for his daughter had undermined his duty as a Navy intelligence officer. In military service, personal interests were subordinated to mission requirements. Officers who couldn't maintain professional objectivity were removed from sensitive assignments. Admiral, I request permission to present witness testimony, Frank said. Morrison nodded. Call your first witness. Tommy Rodriguez entered the hearing room, wearing his dress uniform, the young intelligence officer who'd served as Frank's partner throughout the Cross investigation. His testimony would be crucial in establishing the operational timeline and Frank's conduct during the surveillance period. Petty Officer Rodriguez, Colonel Martinez began, described Commander Walsh's behavior during the 8 months preceding Mr. Cross's arrest. Tommy's responses were crisp and professional. Sir, Commander Walsh maintained excellent operational discipline throughout the surveillance period. His analysis of the target's activities was thorough and objective. When we discovered the personal connection to his family, he immediately reported it to operational command. Did he show signs of emotional compromise or biased judgment? No, sir. If anything, he became more focused on gathering admissible evidence that would ensure successful prosecution. He understood that any appearance of personal motivation could jeopardize the entire case. Frank listened as Tommy described their partnership, the months of careful investigation, the professional excellence that had characterized their work until the night everything became personal. Petty Officer Rodriguez, Admiral Morrison asked, in your opinion, did Commander Walsh's intervention during the arrest serve legitimate operational purposes? Yes, ma'am. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Mrs. Cross was going into premature labor caused by trauma stress, and the target was becoming increasingly agitated. Commander Walsh's decision to reveal his authority and take control prevented potential harm to civilian personnel, while ensuring the arrest proceeded smoothly. After Tommy's testimony, the tribunal heard from Dr. Sarah Chen, the Navy medical officer who delivered hope during the crisis. Her account of the emergency delivery painted Frank's actions as heroic rather than compromised. A father and grandfather whose military training had saved lives during an impossible situation. Admiral Morrison, Frank said when given the opportunity to present his final argument, I've served this nation for 25 years. I've missed family gatherings, holidays, and critical moments in my daughter's life because duty required it. But on the night of Jonathan Cross's arrest, duty and family aligned for the first time in my career. The tribunal members listened as Frank described the impossible choice he'd faced, maintaining operational cover while his pregnant daughter endured violence from the traitor he was investigating. My intervention wasn't about personal bias or compromised judgment, Frank continued. It was about preventing immediate harm to innocent civilians while ensuring that 8 months of evidence gathering would result in successful prosecution of a man who threatened both national security and my family's safety. Admiral Morrison conferred quietly with her colleagues before delivering the tribunal's decision. Commander Walsh, this tribunal finds that your actions during Operation Crosscurrent, while unconventional, served legitimate operational and humanitarian purposes. The evidence against Jonathan Cross was obtained through professional surveillance methods that remain legally admissible despite your personal connection to the case. Frank felt the tension in his shoulders release for the first time in weeks. However, Morrison continued, we also find that your emotional involvement in this case created potential conflicts of interest that could have compromised operational security. Therefore, this tribunal recommends that you be reassigned to shore duty for the remainder of your service obligation. Shore duty meant Frank would remain stateside, available for family obligations, while serving in positions that didn't require extended deployments or classified travel. It was exactly what he'd requested weeks earlier when Rebecca needed his support during her legal battle with Jonathan. Thank you, Admiral, Frank said. I accept the tribunal's recommendation. As he left the hearing room, Frank realized that for the first time in his military career, professional discipline and personal values had reached the same conclusion. Choosing family over career advancement wasn't a sacrifice. It was a promotion to the most important mission of his life. Jonathan Cross would stand trial for treason with all the evidence Frank's team had gathered. The tribunal had validated his actions while providing the shore assignment that would keep him close to Rebecca and Hope. After 25 years of serving his country, Frank was finally free to serve his family. 8 months after Hope's birth, Rebecca sat in the conference room of Daniels, Martinez, and Associates, reviewing the final custody agreement that would formally terminate Jonathan's parental rights. The legal battle had been long and expensive, but Jonathan's conviction on 12 federal charges of treason, espionage, and conspiracy had eliminated any possibility of his maintaining contact with their daughter. Life without possibility of parole, her attorney Jennifer Martinez said with satisfaction. Mr. Cross will never threaten you or Hope again. Frank sat beside his daughter, wearing civilian clothes that still couldn't disguise his military bearing. Shore duty had been an adjustment after decades of deployment-based assignments, but he'd found purpose in his new role as intelligence analyst at the Norfolk Naval Station, work that kept him close to family while utilizing his expertise in counterintelligence operations. What about his appeal? Rebecca asked, because Jonathan's legal team had promised to challenge the conviction through every available avenue. Federal treason convictions are rarely overturned, Martinez replied. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and your testimony was particularly compelling. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Rebecca remembered that day in federal court when she'd finally told her complete story. 3 years of systematic abuse, financial control, and psychological manipulation, culminating in the public violence that had exposed Jonathan's true nature. Facing her abuser across a crowded courtroom had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating. "There's one more document to sign," Martinez said, sliding papers across the mahogany conference table. The name change petition, making Hope's legal name Hope Rebecca Walsh instead of Hope Cross. Rebecca signed with steady hands, officially severing any connection between her daughter and the man who'd terrorized them both. Hope would grow up knowing she was a Walsh, part of a military family with traditions of service and honor, rather than criminality and abuse. "Congratulations," Martinez said, gathering the completed paperwork. "You're officially free." Free. The word carried weight that Rebecca was still learning to appreciate. Free to make decisions without fear of violent consequences. Free to maintain friendships and family relationships without permission or surveillance. Free to raise her daughter according to her own values rather than Jonathan's twisted worldview. Walking out of the law office with Frank, Rebecca felt lighter than she had in years. Hope, now 8 months old and thriving, slept peacefully in her carrier, oblivious to the legal proceedings that had secured her future safety. "How does it feel?" Frank asked as they reached his car. "Scary," Rebecca admitted. "Good scary, but still scary. I haven't made independent decisions in so long that sometimes I feel lost." Frank had been watching his daughter navigate the transition from abuse victim to independent woman with a mixture of pride and concern. Rebecca was strong, intelligent, and capable, but 3 years of systematic psychological control had damaged her confidence in ways that would take time to heal. "You're doing better than you think," Frank said. "The nonprofit is thriving, Hope is healthy and happy, and you're building a life that's entirely your own creation." Shruyin. Rebecca's nonprofit organization, Haven House, had grown from a concept discussed during her recovery into a fully operational support center for domestic violence survivors. Using her experience with Jonathan's control tactics and Frank's military connections for security resources, Haven House provided both emotional support and practical assistance for women escaping dangerous relationships. "I got a call from the State Department yesterday," Rebecca said as they drove toward her apartment. "They want me to consult on a project helping military spouses deal with domestic violence. Apparently, my story has become something of a case study." Frank felt a surge of pride hearing how his daughter had transformed her trauma into purpose. Haven House had helped dozens of women escape situations similar to Rebecca's, providing the kind of comprehensive support that she desperately needed during her marriage to Jonathan. "That's incredible," Frank said. "You're becoming the person you were meant to be." "I'm becoming the person Mom raised me to be," Rebecca corrected, referring to the woman who died while Frank was deployed on a classified mission. "Strong, independent, capable of helping others while taking care of my own family." The reference to her mother was significant. Rebecca had spent years angry with Frank for missing critical family moments, but she was beginning to understand that military service was about protecting families like theirs from threats they might never fully comprehend. They reached Rebecca's apartment complex, a secure building Frank had helped her select when she'd needed to establish independence from Jonathan's financial control. The one-bedroom unit was small but comfortable, decorated with Hope's toys and Rebecca's growing collection of books about childhood development and trauma recovery. "She's getting heavy," Rebecca said, lifting Hope from her car seat. At 8 months, the baby was curious and active, reaching for everything within her grasp and babbling constantly in the proto-language that preceded actual words. "Strong, like her mother," Frank observed, watching Hope grab for his military insignia with determined little fingers. Inside the apartment, Rebecca prepared Hope's afternoon meal while Frank reviewed case files from Haven House. His new role in his daughter's life included providing security assessments for women whose estranged partners posed ongoing threats. "There's something I want to discuss with you," Rebecca said, settling into the living room with Hope on her lap. "About the future." Frank looked up from the files, recognizing the tone of voice that indicated important conversations. Rebecca had inherited her mother's ability to address difficult topics directly and honestly. "I've been thinking about dating," Rebecca continued. "Not immediately, not seriously, but eventually. Hope deserves to see healthy relationships, and I need to learn how to trust people again." The subject was delicate. Frank's protective instincts as both father and grandfather made him want to screen any potential suitors with the thoroughness of a military background investigation. But he also recognized that Rebecca needed to make her own choices about relationships and intimacy. "I think that's healthy," Frank said carefully. "When you're ready." "I want you to promise me something," Rebecca said. "No investigating the men I date. No running background checks or surveillance operations. I need to learn to trust my own judgment again, which means making my own mistakes if necessary." Frank winced because he'd already been considering exactly those protective measures. Military fathers didn't easily release control over their children's safety, especially when those children had survived trauma that could have been prevented with better intelligence. "I promise to try," Frank said, "but I reserve the right to provide unsolicited opinions if someone seems dangerous." Rebecca laughed, the first genuinely carefree sound Frank had heard from her since before her marriage to Jonathan. "Deal. But remember, I survived 3 years with a traitor who sold military secrets to foreign adversaries. I think I can handle screening potential boyfriends." Hope clapped her hands and laughed, as if celebrating her mother's growing confidence and independence. At 8 months, she was developing the personality traits that would define her character: curious, determined, social, and completely unafraid of new experiences. "What about you?" Rebecca asked, turning the conversation toward Frank's future. "Are you planning to date? Hope needs to see her grandfather modeling healthy relationships too." The question surprised Frank because he hadn't considered romantic possibilities since his wife's death 8 years ago. Military life had consumed his emotional energy, and then the investigation of Jonathan had occupied all his attention. But shore duty provided stability and routine that made personal relationships possible for the first time in decades. "I don't know," Frank admitted. "I've been focused on rebuilding our family relationship and supporting your transition to independence. Romance seems like a complication I don't need right now." "It's not about need," Rebecca said, bouncing Hope gently on her knee. "It's about deserving happiness and companionship. Mom wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone because you feel guilty about missing time with us." The insight was uncomfortable because it was accurate. Frank had been carrying guilt about his wife's death, his absence during Rebecca's childhood, and his failure to protect his daughter from Jonathan's abuse. Seeking personal happiness felt selfish when his family had paid such high prices for his career choices. "Besides," Rebecca continued with a mischievous smile, "Hope needs to learn that love comes in many forms. Grandparents who find companionship, parents who choose partners carefully, families that support each other through difficult transitions." Frank looked at his granddaughter, who was examining his watch with intense concentration, and realized Rebecca was right. Hope would learn about relationships by observing the adults in her life. If those adults isolated themselves out of fear or guilt, she would internalize unhealthy messages about love and trust. "Maybe," Frank conceded, "when the time feels right." "When you meet someone who makes you laugh," Rebecca suggested. "Someone who understands military life but isn't intimidated by it. Someone who appreciates what you've accomplished but doesn't expect you to choose career over family ever again." The conversation was interrupted by Hope's determined attempt to grab Frank's coffee mug, her tiny hands surprisingly strong and coordinated for 8 months old. "She's going to be trouble," Frank observed, gently redirecting her attention to age-appropriate toys. "The best kind of trouble," Rebecca agreed. "Curious, fearless, determined to explore everything around her, just like her grandmother was at that age." Frank felt the familiar pang of loss when Rebecca mentioned her mother, but it was gentler now, mixed with gratitude for the years they'd had together and hope for the family they were rebuilding. "There's something else," Rebecca said, her tone shifting to the serious register she used for important announcements. "I've been accepted to graduate school, online program so I can maintain Haven House and take care of Hope, but it's a master's degree in social work with a specialization in trauma counseling." Darunenun. Frank felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with military accomplishments. His daughter was transforming her painful experiences into professional qualifications that would help other women escape dangerous situations. "That's incredible," Frank said. "When do you start?" "Fall semester. It's a 3-year program designed for working professionals. By the time I graduate, Hope will be old enough for preschool, and I'll have the credentials to expand Haven House into a full-service counseling center. The vision Rebecca was describing represented everything Frank had hoped for his daughter: independence, purpose, professional success, and the ability to help others while providing stability for her own child. "I'm proud of you," Frank said, the words carrying decades of unexpressed emotion. "Your mother would be incredibly proud too." Rebecca reached over and squeezed Frank's hand, a gesture that symbolized the forgiveness and healing that had characterized their relationship since Hope's birth. "We're going to be okay," Rebecca said, looking around the apartment that represented her hard-won independence. "All of us. Hope will grow up knowing she's loved and safe and part of a family that chooses each other every day." Frank nodded, watching his granddaughter explore her toys with the fearless curiosity that would define her approach to life. Hope would never know her biological father, but she would grow up surrounded by love and security and the knowledge that her family had fought for her future. "The Walsh women are pretty amazing," Frank observed. "The Walsh family is pretty amazing," Rebecca corrected, "including the Navy commander who chose family over career when it mattered most." Outside the apartment windows, Norfolk's skyline glittered in the late afternoon sun. A city where military families learned to balance service with love, duty with devotion, honor with happiness. For the first time in 8 years, Frank Walsh felt like he was exactly where he belonged. 1 year after Hope's dramatic birth in the Grandview Hotel penthouse, Rebecca stood at the podium of that same hotel's conference center, addressing an audience of military spouses, social workers, and domestic violence advocates gathered for the first annual Haven House Symposium on Breaking the Silence, Military Families, and Domestic Violence. The circular symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The hotel where Rebecca had been publicly slapped by her abusive husband was now hosting a conference designed to help other women escape similar situations. The marble lobby where Frank had recognized his estranged daughter in crisis was filled with registration tables staffed by Haven House volunteers. "15 months ago," Rebecca began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd transformed trauma into purpose, "I stood in this hotel's lobby carrying my unborn daughter and believing I had no options, no resources, and no hope of escaping the man who controlled every aspect of my life." Hope, now 13 months old and walking with determined, wobbly steps, played quietly in the conference room's childcare area under the watchful supervision of Frank and several Haven House volunteers. She was a beautiful, curious toddler with her mother's determined spirit and her grandfather's steady gaze. "Tonight," Rebecca continued, "I stand before you as a survivor, an advocate, and the mother of a little girl who will grow up knowing that love never involves fear, control never masquerades as protection, and family means choosing each other's happiness and safety every single day." The audience, nearly 300 people from across the military community, listened with the focused attention of individuals who understood that Rebecca's story represented hope for countless other families struggling with domestic violence in military settings. Frank sat in the front row wearing his dress blue uniform, his chest displaying the ribbons and decorations earned over 25 years of distinguished service. Beside him sat Dr. Patricia Stone, the family court judge who'd handled Rebecca's custody case and who'd become an unexpected friend during the legal proceedings against Jonathan. "The statistics about domestic violence in military families are sobering," Rebecca continued, sharing research that Haven House had compiled over the past year. "Deployment stress, PTSD, weapons training, and the culture of command and control can create environments where abuse flourishes if we don't actively work to prevent it." The presentation outlined Haven House's comprehensive approach to supporting military families: counseling services, legal advocacy, emergency housing, childcare support, and job training programs that helped abuse survivors rebuild their lives with dignity and independence. "But tonight isn't just about problems," Rebecca said, clicking to a slide showing photographs of Haven House success stories. "It's about solutions. It's about the 47 women who found safety and independence through our programs this year. It's about the children who are learning that healthy relationships are possible. It's about military families choosing healing over silence." In the audience, Frank felt the pride that had become familiar over the past year as he'd watched Rebecca transform herself from abuse victim to community leader. Haven House had grown from a concept discussed during her recovery into a nationally recognized organization that other military communities were replicating. I want to introduce someone whose story illustrates the power of family resilience, Rebecca said, gesturing toward Frank. My father, Commander Frank Walsh, who taught me that duty and love aren't competing values. They're complementary forces that make us stronger when we align them properly. Frank approached the podium with the bearing of someone accustomed to addressing military audiences, but his message tonight was personal rather than professional. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank began, I spent 25 years believing that serving my country meant sacrificing my family relationships. I missed birthdays, holidays, school events, and critical moments in my daughter's life because I thought duty required that level of personal sacrifice. The audience recognized the familiar struggle of military families, the constant tension between service obligations and family needs that define their daily lives. What I learned during the investigation that led to my daughter's rescue is that protecting families like ours and protecting individual family members aren't separate missions, Frank continued. They're the same mission viewed from different perspectives. Frank described the impossible situation he'd faced, watching his daughter endure abuse while building a case against the traitor who was tormenting her. The investigation that had begun as professional duty had become deeply personal when family and national security intersected. The most important lesson I can share with military families is this. Service to country and service to family strengthen each other when we approach them with wisdom and balance. Frank said, our children need to see us choosing both honor and love, both duty and devotion. After the formal presentations, the symposium shifted to breakout sessions where military spouses could discuss specific challenges with counselors, legal advocates, and other survivors who understood their experiences. Rebecca moved through the groups, sharing her story and listening to others with the empathy that had made Haven House so effective. Mrs. Walsh, said Captain Maria Santos, a Navy psychologist who'd driven from Virginia Beach to attend the conference, I wanted to thank you for creating this resource. We've had 3 families in our command seek help through Haven House this year, and the comprehensive support has been life-changing. Rebecca had learned to accept gratitude gracefully, understanding that her willingness to share her story publicly helped other women recognize their own situations and seek help before violence escalated. The most important thing is breaking the isolation, Rebecca replied. Abusers succeed by convincing their victims that no one will believe them, no one will help them, and no one understands what they're experiencing. When we create communities like this, we prove that support exists. As the evening concluded, Frank and Rebecca packed up Hope's toys and gathered their materials, the toddler chattering happily in the proto-language that would soon become actual words. She won't remember tonight, Rebecca said, watching Hope wave goodbye to the volunteers who'd entertained her during the conference. But she'll grow up in a world where events like this exist, where military families support each other, where her story includes trauma but isn't defined by it. Soprano Frank nodded, understanding that Hope's childhood would be fundamentally different from Rebecca's, surrounded by community support, extended family involvement, and adults who prioritized her safety and happiness above all other considerations. What's next? Frank asked as they walked through the hotel lobby where everything had changed 15 months earlier. Graduate school starts next month, Rebecca replied, shifting Hope to her other hip. Haven House is expanding to 3 new military communities, and I have a date next weekend with David Martinez, the Navy psychologist from Norfolk who actually makes me laugh and isn't intimidated by my protective father. Frank smiled, recognizing that Rebecca was rebuilding her life with the same determination she'd shown in escaping Jonathan's control. David Martinez was a good man. Frank had restrained himself to only basic background research, who understood both military culture and trauma recovery. And you, Rebecca asked, any romantic developments I should know about? Frank's relationship with Patricia Stone had evolved slowly over the months since Hope's custody case, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting families like theirs. At 62, Patricia brought wisdom and independence to their friendship, along with an understanding of the legal system that complemented Frank's military expertise. Patricia and I are having dinner tomorrow night, Frank admitted. Nothing dramatic, just 2 people who enjoy each other's company and share similar values. That's exactly what you both deserve, Rebecca said approvingly. As they reached the parking garage, Hope fell asleep in her car seat, exhausted by the excitement of being surrounded by so many new people. Rebecca and Frank stood beside their vehicles, looking back at the hotel where their family's healing had begun. "Mom would be proud of what we built," Rebecca said, referring to the woman whose death had marked the beginning of their 8-year estrangement. "She would be proud of what you've built," Frank corrected. "I just got lucky enough to be part of it." Rebecca hugged her father with one arm while balancing Hope with the other, a gesture that symbolized the family they'd reconstructed from trauma and forgiveness and determination to choose love over fear. "See you Sunday for dinner?" Rebecca asked, referring to their weekly family tradition that had developed over the past year. "Wouldn't miss it," Frank replied, understanding that showing up consistently for small moments was how he'd rebuild trust after years of choosing duty over presence. As they drove away from the hotel in separate cars, both Frank and Rebecca felt the satisfaction of people who'd transformed their worst moments into their greatest purpose. Hope would grow up hearing the story of her dramatic birth, her grandfather's heroic rescue, and her mother's courageous testimony that had sent a traitor to prison for life. But more importantly, Hope would grow up experiencing daily love, weekly family dinners, bedtime stories, birthday parties, and all the ordinary moments that had been absent from her mother's childhood because of Frank's earlier choices. The Walsh family had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting trauma or pretending damage hadn't occurred. Healing was about choosing each other every day, building new traditions that honored both service and family, and creating the kind of love that made children feel safe enough to explore the world with curiosity and confidence. In the rearview mirror, the Grandview Hotel disappeared into Norfolk's skyline, but its transformation from crime scene to conference venue symbolized everything the Walsh family had accomplished. From crisis had come purpose. From estrangement had come deeper connection. From trauma had come the wisdom to help other families find safety and healing. Hope Rebecca Walsh would grow up knowing that her family had chosen love over fear, healing over resentment, and each other over everything else that tried to separate them, and that knowledge would make all the difference in the world. The end. Minor. Final word count. 19 or 447 words. This complete story delivers the dramatic promise of the title while exploring themes of family reconciliation, domestic violence recovery, military service, and personal transformation. The narrative follows Rebecca's journey from isolated abuse victim to empowered community leader, Frank's evolution from absent father to protective family patriarch, and Hope's birth into a family that chooses healing over trauma. The story includes realistic legal proceedings, military protocols, and domestic violence dynamics while maintaining hope and providing satisfying justice for all characters.